president of St Albans Civic Society, is with us now on Mixed Mornings. My goodness, a frustrating bunch of things we're going to talk about this morning, Tim. In a little bit, we'll talk about garden rooms. Can't see why that's frustrating, but you will find out. And Network Rail and some of their plans for the trees around the area. But let's start with some planning things. The local plan is just coming out, but before we get to that, rail freight, the terminal on the old airfield site there, Tim, what is happening now?
Oh, hello, Nick. Yes, I mean, a lot of people will be very disappointed in this. You may remember from our previous conversations that Herts County Council, who own the airfield, were putting it up for sale. And there was a lot of resistance, not just from local residents, but generally because of concerns that what was termed a rail freight would become a lorry freight, and that this would cause havoc with the roads, let alone the local people having to look on lots of warehouses. Anyway, the bad news from St Albans' point of view is that Herts County Council have actually now sold the land to Segro, the rail freight developers.
Right, and there was a sort of argument about whether they had to or not, wasn't there? But it kind of went along party lines, and they decided to sell. So that is done now. So is that the end of it? That's it? They've sold it, the planning permission's there, we're finished?
Well, it may not be the end, but obviously it will be very difficult for those who are trying to fight the fight the freight, which was their motto. They have got another opportunity to block it, and that would be by going to judicial review. And I guess the freight people will be thinking about that. Judicial review, of course, is very uncertain and expensive, but it may be the last gasp attempt to stop this development.
Oh, well, I suppose if you believe it brings lots of employment, good news, but otherwise pretty bad news, because you think it's going to bring lots of traffic disruption and just a bit of an eyesore.
But the problem is it won't bring a lot of employment to St Albans, which anyway, St Albans has a very low rate of unemployment, 1%. Yeah. It may bring employment for other people, but how are they going to get there? Well, they'll probably get by car, and you'll have the lorries, and unfortunately the 414 road, which has enormous traffic problems now in terms of congestion, will have even more in the future. So the future scenario is looking pretty gloomy. So it will be interesting to see what happens next.
All right. Well, now here's something to lift our spirits, or is it? The local plan is finally seeing the light of day. We've got the oldest local plan in the country, and that's a problem because it means that developers can pretty much do more or less what they want. But it is seeing the light of day, but it's sort of good news, bad news story, isn't it, Tim?
Well, yes. The local plan came before the Planning Policy and Climate Committee on the 26th of June, and I think it's caused quite a lot of consternation, because a major part of the local plan is identifying sites for new housing, and the sites that have been identified go into the green belt quite a lot. The problem is that the figures that they are using to identify the need go back to the 2014 Office for the ONC, the National Statistics, the Office for National Statistics, and they are requiring, on the standard method as it's called, 888 houses per year, and this is going to be quite a challenge.
And so therefore the assumption is that those will have to, some of them at least, or the majority of them will have to go on greenbelt land. Is that the thinking?
That's the problem. And people are challenging, and the councillors, I watched the webcast of this, people are challenging why the district council, the city and district council, are going with the old figures when Michael Gove, who's the Secretary of State, has said they're not compulsory. And if they went for, say, the census figures of 2021 and the projections from that, they would only need, rather than 888 houses, they would just need about 230 houses per year. So there's a significant difference.
Well,
And of
I
course,
suppose we need to ask the councillors on the committee, don't we? But any clues as to why they would have done that? It seems sort of obvious to use the 2021 numbers.
well, the response from the officer was that the concern is that because the government haven't issued any new figures, these are just projections and calculations, have not said they would accept a local plan based on those. They feel they must go ahead on the old figures. Certainly some councils were saying, well, can't we hedge our bets and have two local plans, one using those figures and one using the other? And also others arguing, well, isn't this a good argument for delaying and waiting to see what the government come up with? The government have committed themselves to revising the NPPF, which is the National Planning Policy Framework, and that could then hint at a different demography, particularly for the south and the southeast, which is overburdened at the moment in terms of the expectation of the amount of housing they should build. So it's a
so we're kind of, it sounds a little bit like we're ploughing on with a plan that might actually turn out not to be the plan, because we can't just leave it with no plan. That we should ask the council, shouldn't we? I think we'll be doing that very soon here on Mixed Mornings. But I mean,
yes, I think that's the situation.
It does seem slightly Kafkaesque at this point, but there we are.
It is a very weird situation to be in, and it's not quite clear when the government will actually come up with their new planning policy. But of course, the present government have got quite a few other problems to think about, so maybe it's not on their front burner. But will have a huge impact on the district of St Albans, particularly on some of the villages outlying. For example, Redbourne. The character of Redbourne will be dramatically changed by the number of sites that have been identified for housing around it.
All right, Tim. Well, thank you for explaining that rather odd situation, quite complicated too. So thanks for doing that. Our guest is Tim Boatswain, President of St Albans Civic Society. We'll be back in just a few minutes talking about garden rooms, those sheds at the bottom of the garden, and trees. We'll be back with Tim after this. Tim Boatswain is President of St Albans Civic Society. He's also our guest this morning on Mixed Mornings. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Nick.
Now, garden rooms, I like to think of them as sheds at the bottom of the garden, but tell us why they're beginning to be a bit of a hot potato.
Well, there is a concern, and you can see this probably goes back to COVID and more people working from home and wanting somewhere separate to work. And there does seem to be now a proliferation of garden rooms. And the concern, I think, is mainly coming from the area of conservation, the conservation areas, because garden rooms can quite change the character of a place. Particularly, for example, if you're looking down at the River Ver and you can get a view across the gardens, suddenly that view will be changed and the nature of the conservation area will be changed. So there is a concern that at the moment the planning department are not resisting garden rooms, even though they may well have good grounds for resisting it because of what it would do to the character of an area.
It's a tricky one, though, isn't it? It is your garden in the end, and you've got a small house you face trading up, very expensive, or sticking up. I mean, the garden rooms are not cheap, but they're cheaper than moving. It is a tricky one, isn't it? There's a balance here between personal rights and the right for me to go and look at the River Ver and it looks pretty.
I think that's right, and there's sort of issues, particularly with the conservation area, about what you can do, in terms of, say, changing your windows, and how the council will reject the opportunity of you using PVC or whatever. So, and there's of course another big debate going on about solar panels in conservation areas, and we're being urged.
Is there? Okay.
Constantly. We're being urged constantly, obviously, to reduce our carbon footprint. And a way of doing this would be solar panels. But at the moment, if you try and put a solar panel in the conservation area on the front of your house, if that's facing south, I'm afraid you would be denied that opportunity. So it is tricky, as you say. There's this balance between your personal freedom on something you own to do what you want to do, but at the same time preserving the character of an area within a conservation area.
Interesting. We'll maybe put some of this to the council in due course. And now Network Rail have got some plans for a bit of trimming, haven't they, Tim? It's not going down very well.
Well, it's a sort of deja vu. I remember personally getting involved back in 2018 when a letter went out to many residents whose houses were on the line, at the back of the line. And of course, on those strips, there's often a lot of trees and wildlife. And in some of the trees, of course, you've got protected species like bats. And back in 2018, I think residents got really concerned because certain areas there was, well, almost to exaggerate, but people were saying, gosh, it looks like Hiroshima. They've knocked everyththing down. Not a very good
exaggeration, perhaps, but still. Yeah.
Similarly, I should say. But so there was concern. And back in 2018, the Network Rail, in fact, and their contractors did back down from a rather more brutal type of what we'll call vegetation management to something that was more acceptable. Anyway, they want to do it again. And of course, their concern is the safety of trains, falling trees, and leaves on the line, dare I say it, and so on. So they're always concerned. I think the rules are they should have 6 meters cut back either side, where there's virtually just grasses and no overhanging vegetation or anything. But it's concerned residents again whose houses run along the railway line, and there is going to be a meeting tomorrow, actually, in Marshallwick Community Centre at 5 o'clock, open to the public, to meet the Network Rail contractors. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But trees, wildlife, protecting species like bats and badgers and so on, it is very tricky at the moment. And quite rightly, people want to preserve our natural fauna and flora. But we can understand Network Rail at the same time want their trains to run on time and safely.
Well, let's hope we can find some sort of compromise there. But if you do want to go along, the meeting is at Marshallswick Community Centre tomorrow night at 5 p.m. Tim, thank you so much for keeping an eye on all these very important topics for us around the lived environment. So thank you very much for doing that. Tim Boatswain is President of St Albans Civic Society. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Mix 9.